It seems like AI is driving the train, but it isn't, and it doesn't have to feel that way. AI is dependent on humans. Humans are not dependent on AI. And so whenever I hear people talk about a model learning or intelligence, I try to reframe that use the phrase, humans trained AI to do this. We have more power certainly than it feels like, and we should use that power. There's a quote from Ursula Franklin, who's a physicist, educator, and activist, who said that the success of technology, like democracy, depends on justice and laws to enforce it. And I think psychologists also have a place in contributing to developing those laws to hopefully create more justice in the use of AI for mental health.
Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Beyond the Couch, AI and Psychology. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. Now, as always, before we get started, I want to thank the organizations that make this podcast possible. This episode is sponsored by the American Board of Professional Psychology, the National Register of Health Service Psychologists, and my consulting firm, Wayde AI. Their support helps us create thoughtful, psychology-focused conversations about how AI is shaping our field. Okay, I'm very excited to introduce you to our next guest, Dr. Paige Anderson, who is a leader in digital mental health and clinical innovation. Dr. Anderson is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at Georgia State University and a licensed clinical psychologist with board certification in behavioral and cognitive psychology. Her research focuses on how emerging technologies can be used in mental health care, including studies on social anxiety disorder and studies examining engagement and effectiveness of digital mental health tools. She's also contributed to national efforts shaping the future of AI in psychology, including the American Psychological Association's work on AI and mental health applications. Her work has been featured on CNN, NPR, and the Discovery Channel, among others. Paige, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you here, and I'd love to dive into your work. But before we get started, I always like to start by asking, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and the journey that led you to AI, including some of those experiences that might have shaped your perspective?
Sure. Well, I'll start with a confession that may resonate with a lot of psychologists and your listeners. I am not a technology person. I do not enjoy tinkering with computers. I don't play video games. I don't even have personal social media accounts, although my lab has an account. Um, I found it easier to write my dissertation than to
Mhm.
program the universal remote on my TV. I am a very in real life kind of person, and my kids can't believe that this is my area of research. But all that said, I am a psychologist, and like most psychologists, I'm drawn to the field because I'm a people person and
Mhm.
I want to help people. And ironically, it's that mindset that led me to technology. So after graduation, I wanted an academic job, but I had the opportunity to become the first and only full-time employee of a small business high-tech startup company called Virtually Better, founded by a psychologist and computer scientist. And they were pioneers in using virtual reality for exposure therapy to treat anxiety disorders. And as you know, exposure therapy is one of the great success stories for psychology. It works, but a lot of people don't want to do it. It's hard for clients to do it. It's hard for clinicians to do it. Not many clinicians are trained. And so, right out of graduate school, I was presented with this opportunity. And so, I found the idea of having people face their fears in a virtual world
Mhm.
that could face them in the real world, just thrilling, creative, potentially transformational in terms of increasing access to science-based treatment. So this was in 1999, but that experience really expanded my sense of what psychology could be and launched my academic career at the intersection of tech and mental health.
Yeah, I love that story.
Yes. But then technology became much more personal. I have 3 children. One of them developed complex, chronic medical conditions early in life, and that affected brain development and learning. And, for a while, it was unclear whether he'd be able to live independently, but, I'm happy to say that today he's 22. He lives on his own halfway across the country, works full-time as a restaurant manager, and fully supports himself.
Awesome.
That would not be possible without assistive technology
Hmm.
powered by AI. And that's when the transformational potential of technology went from like an idea and theoretically interesting to having like profound real life experiences for me. And I spoke with him just last week, and he told me that he'd just bought AI-enabled smart glasses to help him, with his executive functioning, and so he could record our conversation, he did, and then sent me a summary of our conversation that we had on the phone afterwards. So he is an early adopter. And then finally, professionally, most recently, I became part of the inaugural, NIH Aim Ahead Consortium Clinic Fellowship that focuses on generative AI and health equity. And I was one of 2 psychologists among physicians, nurses, all kind of health professionals, and I really got to see just how creatively Gen AI was being used across health disciplines.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and around that same time, I went to a wedding, and I was telling people about my fellowship, and literally every person I talked to said that they or a friend or a loved one was using generative AI for therapy.
Hmm.
So it's clear to me that people, especially young people, are already using Gen AI for mental health and coping, often without our guidance. And I think ethically, professionally, clinically, we as psychologists don't have the luxury to ignore that. I think we have a responsibility to understand these tools and to shape how they're used and to meet people where they are. And where a lot of them are on publicly available chatbots.
Yeah, I love that example. I kind of want to start there as well, right? So you mentioned that everybody at the wedding said that they were using it in some way, shape, or form. So what role do you actually see AI playing in the mental health context? What is it helping people do? Why are people using it?
Well, I think why people are using it is because it's very hard to access mental health services, especially from clinical psychologists, and there are many reasons for that. There are well-known, scientifically identified barriers to in-person services, being able to find a provider, having insurance to pay for those services, being able to get off of work to attend those services. But then just importantly, there are attitudinal barriers, I think, to psychological services. The sense of stigma that, if I seek services, I'm broken or I'm going to bring shame to the people in my community or my family. There's good data from the WHO that low perceived need for services is a real barrier, that most of the people who meet criteria for a DSM diagnosis of a psychological disorder do not feel like their problems are bad enough to warrant treating it.
Hmm.
And so I think that, I mean, this is an empirical question,
Right.
um, but I think it's possible that AI, generative AI can get around many of those barriers. And I think perhaps the most important, like, behavioral principle is that it is immediate. You don't have to make there's little friction. You don't have to find a therapist, find if they're covered by your insurance, make a call, see if they're taking new clients, and then get on a waiting list to see them in 3 or 4 weeks. You can pop a question into a large language model and get an immediate result. And I think that immediacy is really important for why people are also going to these
Yeah.
spots.
I think all of those make a lot of sense. There was some research recently, the last time I looked at this, that said almost 40% of the younger population prefer to use AI instead of going to mental health professionals. So people are definitely finding value with it. From your perspective, what do you think is the role of the psychologist in this relationship? Do we have a role in this relationship still when people are using AI, or should we just how do you think we should be engaging with them as they're using these tools?
Well, I think we need to just engage, period. First of all, there's data from APA from 2 years ago that the majority of psychologists had never used artificial intelligence themselves, even among early career psychologists. Now that is increasing. Last year's survey showed, uh, increasing use among psychologists.
Yeah,
But
almost
also
50%, I
within
think.
Pardon?
Almost 50% now.
Almost 50% now, but that still feels very low to me. So I think there's ways for psychologists to be involved to try to ethically incorporate AI into their own practices.
Mhm.
But I think there's also a role for psychologists to help people, systems, organizations, governments create guidelines that can maximize the potential for good and minimize the potential for harm. Because we definitely know that using AI can cause harm, and there are at least 3 cases I know of from 2025 where parents of, teenagers are filing suit against the large companies, because they believe that, their interactions with their chatbot contributed to their suicide. And I think the more psychologists are involved, we'll have a lot more potential for good and less potential for harm.
Yeah, I like that approach. Now, you mentioned specifically that more and more people are grappling with how to use ethical AI and how to incorporate into their organizations. And we're talking about how more and more psychologists are trying to sort of get themselves more comfortable with AI. From your perspective, how can they do that, right? How can they incorporate AI ethically into their practice? What does that look like in a day-to-day practice?
Well, I think before you get to the day-to-day practice, one needs to back up and talk about training, because AI is new for all of us in a professional context, or most of us. ChatGPT just came out in 2022, and I think there's a real generational difference with senior psychologists who are in charge of training programs, having maybe more of a discomfort and unfamiliarity with artificial intelligence than younger generations are, but it's us senior psychologists who are in charge of training the generation growing up. And I think people who are in practice settings full time, if they're in an institutional setting, like a hospital, like the institution may be driving the incorporation of AI into practice. But if you're on your own as a solo practitioner, I think there's just a lot of fears, beliefs that one, it can't be used ethically, um, and worry about that maybe it could be used ethically, but I don't know enough about it or how to do that.
So what is your perspective on that? Do you think it can be used ethically, or is it just that we haven't defined what that means yet?
I think we haven't defined what that means yet. I think it's possible. I do think it's possible, but our codes of ethics need to be expanded to incorporate that, and we need to define it in its uses in clinical contexts. So, well, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about there's 2 levels we talked about, right? There's the current clinicians who may be trying to incorporate it into their work. So I'm wondering from that level, how do we prepare them? You know, how do we get them more comfortable with it and help them figure out how to use it ethically? And then there's also the trainees, right? We talked about the people who are going to be joining the field. How do we prepare them differently than what we've been doing now so that they can use AI? I had a conversation with a group of students, graduate students, and the majority of them were using AI already, but none of them had been trained on how to use it ethically or responsibly. So how do we solve those issues?
I think that is a systems issue. And so it needs to be looked at from a systems perspective. And in fact, I recently had some money from Aim Ahead to do a community based systems dynamic workshop looking at current and future psychologists' perspectives on the use of generative AI in clinical practice. And systems dynamics is a way of looking at large complex systems and modeling their change over time. And community-based systems is about gathering information from people with lived experience in these communities, in this case, like psychologists and psychologists to be. So I'm in the middle of sort of analyzing that data to try to identify leverage points in the systems where training can be introduced and how we can facilitate like the ethical adoption of
Yeah.
AI.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great study. I think one of the things that we need to also be working on in terms of helping people prepare is figuring out what's the level of AI literacy that's required, right? Before we say, okay, you can be comfortable and you have the competence now to go and use it or help your clients that are using it as well. Because I
That's
think
right.
that's another thing you mentioned that a lot of clients are using it and we can help them understand some of the boundaries and the risks associated with that. Now, I know you do a lot of work looking at engagement with digital tools. How do we balance tools that are engaging with making sure that they're clinically appropriate and effective?
Well, I mean, I see a split between people who are using these kind of tools without the supervision of psychologists or other licensed mental health, professionals versus people who are using it in the context of, already an established, relationship,
Yeah.
psychotherapy. So if you're a clinician and you're seeing clients, if you're not asking them about their use of generative AI, then you should, because they are using it.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll get, responses that may contradict, what you're saying, or it may facilitate the therapeutic process, but you've gotta know what they're reading about.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. That's one of the questions that should be standard. Do you have any examples of any cases where people have either asked that question and they've been able to bring that information into therapy, or have missed asking that question and has impacted their relationship with the clients?
I haven't had a personal experience like that, but I can, um, refer to a colleague who found out that her client was not liking the way she was being challenged in psychotherapy, and so in psychotherapy, of course, we support and validate, but we also challenge. And of course, some of the AI platforms especially are very sycophantic, and so the client would use generative AI to, sort of get, I think, the validation that the client wanted, and there's nothing wrong inherently wrong with validation. We do that as psychologists, but as trained professionals, we know when to balance validation with challenge to help people meet their goals.
Yeah, that's such a great example. Especially as I think about AI and the way it validates you constantly and consistently, regardless of whether you're right or wrong, or everything you do is great, right? So, what are some of the risks that you see from a clinician point of view if there's a lot of applications in AI in general that's always validating versus, as you mentioned, some of what we do that's sometimes requires to challenge and to push? What are some of the risks for the work that we do, and what expectations people have of therapy?
That's an interesting question. I think there is well, I think we need to distinguish between what psychotherapy is and what chatting with an AI is, because chatting with an AI is not therapy. There are some fit for purpose, generative AI chatbots that are for therapy, but that's not what most people are doing. So I think, like, when I talk to people about how they're using it for therapy, I think, well, that's not therapy. What you're describing is not therapy. Um, so I think helping people distinguish between the 2 in a therapeutic relationship, you have a therapeutic contract. The psychologist is bound by a code of ethics, and there's, protections in place for privacy, and it's a relationship. And none of that is true when people are chatting with, generative AI, although it feels like it
Yeah,
is.
yeah. That's such a great point, right? It feels like to a lot of people that it is, but you identify some really clear boundaries there that psychologists can use to help clients understand the distinction between what they're doing, therapy, and chatting with a chatbot, even though it feels like it. Where do you see the field going moving forward in terms of using AI as an assistive tool for therapy, so that the therapist is using that rather than just it being a direct to consumer where clients are just going directly to that? How do you see that moving forward?
Well, I think sort of the ways clinicians can use it are often really boring, mundane ways. The most common use for clinicians is to use as a scribe,
Mhm.
to help take notes, to gather thoughts, and then to eventually help you draft perhaps a progress note. It can be used to help develop promotional materials or outreach materials. It can be used to there's research coming out. Donovan Ellis, who is helping to develop using AI to develop materials for exposure therapy for compulsive and other anxiety disorders, where there are many things like you can't ethically do for exposure therapy and response prevention if someone has, sacrilegious or, sexual obsessions. And so there's a paper that came out that showed how therapists had created materials, a coloring book for a person who was worried that they were going to go to hell. And so they develop a coloring book. Well, welcome to hell. And that's something that 5 years ago, you couldn't develop those kind of personalized materials, for clients. It would have taken too much time, too much effort, and too much money to do that.
Yes, I'm thinking about that example, and when you talked about the value and the benefit that your son saw in the use of AI. How do you see that potential future generations can take better advantage of some of these tools with the help of some of the things we do as psychologists, providing that psychological framing and guidance. How do you see that happening?
I think that really remains to be seen, but I can share a story from students, from my undergraduate class in psychopathology, in which I gave them an assignment, at the beginning of class, to use their student account, to ask an LLM a question that they had about a mental health topic that we were gonna cover in class. And then I asked them to evaluate that response. What was their first impression? Did it seem accurate? What was the tone? Did it seem culturally biased or culturally nuanced? Was it stigmatizing or not? And so they did evaluate their question, the response, and their questions were fascinating, and their responses or and evaluations were fascinating too. The kinds of questions they're asking are not the kinds of things we typically think about, when
Hmm.
we're doing psychoeducation. Uh,
Yeah.
one, for example, is, "Why would God gift a family a child with autism?" For example. Lot and so people like, students thought that Gen AI did pretty good. It was mostly A's and B's. Now at the end of the class, I had them go back, and after they've learned about, psychological disorders and their psychopathology and their treatment, and had them go back and reevaluate their question, AI's response, and, their evaluation of that response, and they became much more critical consumers. And so part of what I think helping young people, um, learn how to use generative AI positively and appropriately is like, you don't always know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And so you need a little mental health literacy and certainly, digital literacy interact in that way. And I will say probably the most common answer to the question, like, what what do people need? What do students need to be able to use Gen I to access
Yeah.
information about mental health? And they all said critical thinking skills.
Mm.
So that was clear from their point of view.
Yeah, that's a really great example of helping students not just use the tool, but also really interrogate the responses and not just take them, at its word. There are different people that have different approaches of using AI in the classroom. Tell us about your approach and how you use that to foster, as you're talking about, critical thinking.
Developing that assignment, actually. Our university, like most universities, are, like, very interested in helping students develop those skills. And so I don't actually personally use AI as an instructor, like some people use it to make syllabus as and, develop materials and so on and so forth, and inappropriately use it to grade responses. I don't use it in that way. I just tried to create an assignment that would help facilitate those skills for our students.
Okay, that's really cool. Okay, so if a psychologist today wants to approach this thoughtfully, right, where we want more and more psychologists to be engaging at this and trying out, what should they be focused on getting right first?
Well, my first piece of advice would be to understand the privacy policies and the terms of service for any AI platform you use. These documents can be long and hard to understand. And in many other areas of our lives, we just scroll down and click I accept. Um, my kids think I'm crazy for a lot of reasons, but another reason is that, like, they can't believe that I read privacy policies. And I do, or I try to, but it's hard. Um, but I have,
Why is that important here in this situation?
pardon?
Why is that important? Why is it important to make sure they're reading those?
Oh, well, I think you need to understand, to what extent data you might be putting in could be using to train LLM's models, or sharing data from clients that clients have not agreed to share. And so, like, I was worried in my class assignment, like, when students use their student account, is that data being used to train the model? And I asked so many people at the university if that was the case, and actually no one could answer that question. Till finally I talked, like, to someone at a dean level, and they said, "Yes." And I said, "Can you point me to where that is documented?" And she found, a place on the web that said, "This you can use this account under the following, using these terms and services. This account has these privacy policies." But that was so broad as to be meaningless for me.
Yeah.
So what I actually did is, because that's publicly available data, I put it into a AI model and asked AI to explain the terms, services, and privacy policies and asked lots of follow-up questions. And I was much more reassured after I had, uh, really had a clear understanding, but I needed AI to help me get a clear understanding. And I also had the, backup from the administrator.
That's interesting that they were using it to train the model, but they hadn't clearly announced that or made that an option as to
They
whether
were
you could
not they're
opt out
not
of.
using it. No, they're not
They were
using it to
not using
train.
it. Okay.
Yes. So
Okay.
I assumed when I gave students the assignment that if they use their student account, I didn't allow
Mhm.
them to use anything but their student account, that their data would be protected. I
Mhm.
assumed that, but I wanted to find if that was really true. It was hard to find the answer to that question, but when I used AI to help me find the answer to that question, and it allayed my fears.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
my
I
first
think that's
Go ahead.
that's a really a great point, right? We need to be more aware of what happens to the data that we enter into these systems because they can sometimes be used to train the model without your knowledge. And I recently found out that even if you opt out of having the model, having your data to be training the model, if you they had it in there, and I I am learning to read these things more and more in depth. But a colleague of mine pointed out that they have in there that if you provide feedback to the model, that they take that as you're giving consent for them to use that to train the model because you're giving feedback, which then they can then use to train the model. So, you really have to make sure that you're reading these things in great detail.
That's right. I wonder how they operationalize feedback.
This is a good question because that wasn't clear either.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of gray area in there as well, right?
So
Paige,
that's
thank you.
hard to do, yeah.
Yeah. Paige, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate this. How do people contact you if they want to continue the conversation with you?
Because I don't do, media, it's probably email. You can my university email account.
Okay. Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in the
Yeah.
comments. I always want to ask from our experts, what's a tip or recommendation that you can leave us with?
Yeah, so, I'll give a few. In addition to understanding privacy policies, whenever possible, clinicians should use AI platforms that are provided by the organization rather than free general purpose tools, because those platforms typically offer stronger data protection, as we just discussed. A second take home point is that as clinicians, psychologists, you just need to know that AI will be wrong sometimes.
Mhm.
It's you just have to assume my so you always have to verify the accuracy of its responses, and it's not necessarily a failure of AI. AI is doing what we humans train it to do, and we humans are fallible, and, AI won't always be accurate, but AI is trained to please us, and it will give us an answer that sounds plausible and sensible even when it's inaccurate. So that's the second point. A third point I'll make is that AI uses a lot of resources. It feels like it has a life of its own, but it uses a lot of human resources to be able to do the things that it does, and it also uses our Earth's resources. And so, a mental practice I use, whenever I start to use generative I mentally turn on my water faucet at home. And then when I stop using I turn off the faucet because every time you use a large language model, water is being used. I will say that I think psychologists and trainees, again, I'll emphasize need to learn the basics of AI. And I think one good place to start is prompt engineering, which is a technical sounding term, but all it really refers to is the skill of writing clear, precise questions for AI tools. And psychologists are good at knowing how to ask questions. And so that quality of the output that you get is highly dependent on the quality of the prompt. It's not like Googling something where you can just put in part of a word and get relevant responses. And so we need to be training ourselves on prompt engineering. And I guess finally, the thing I want to emphasize the most is that psychologists have agency around generative AI. It seems like AI is driving the train, but it isn't, and it doesn't have to feel that way. AI is dependent on humans. Humans are not dependent on AI. And so whenever I hear people talk about a model learning or intelligence, I try to reframe that use the phrase, humans trained AI to do this. So we have more power certainly than it feels like, and we should use that power. There's a quote from Ursula Franklin, who's a physicist, educator, and activist, who said that the success of technology, like democracy, depends on justice and laws to enforce it. And I think psychologists also have a place in contributing to developing those laws to create more justice in the use of AI for mental health.
Paige, that was very well said. Yes, yes, and amen to all of that. I mean, that was very well said. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And if you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. Feedback is a gift, and we love gifts. We hope you'll join us again soon.